holding in my hands an amazing book, Israel Rising, Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens, The Land of Israel Reawakened. We're going to sit and talk with the author of this book today.
It's time for The Line of Fire with your host, activist, author, international speaker, and theologian, Dr. Michael Brown, your voice of moral, cultural, and spiritual revolution. Michael Brown is the director of the Coalition of Conscience and president of Fire School of Ministry. Get into The Line of Fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. That's 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
You know, I love ebooks. I've got hundreds, thousands of ebooks. Love to be able to read on my cell phone or my e-reader or on my tablet or computer and do research like that. But there are some books that you've got to hold in your hands and you've got to look at to appreciate the majesty, the beauty. And it's the only way to do it. And I'm holding one such book in my hands now. It's absolutely gorgeous. And it is an amazing book with an amazing message. It's called Israel Rising, Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens. It's celebrating 70 years of Israel, 1948 to 2018. The Land of Israel Reawakens. And what it does pictorially, there's text with it, but in an extraordinary way takes you on an amazing journey of prophetic fulfillment. And that's what we are speaking about today. Tonight on the biblical calendar begins Yom Kippur for 24 hours. Jews around the world fasting, praying for forgiveness, a sacred time in the biblical calendar for many Jews, the holiest day of the year. And it's with that sense of sobriety that we look at the amazing acts of God in Israel. This is Michael Brown. You've tuned into The Line of Fire. I'm not taking calls today so I can devote the entire hour to my guest, Doug Hershey, and he is the author of the book, Israel Rising, with photography from Elise Theriault. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But Doug, welcome to The Line of Fire.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be with you.
All right. So Doug, first, your background. Are you Jewish? How did you come to have an interest in Israel? How do you end up in Israel so much?
I was raised in a Christian home, never really connected anything with Judaism or Christianity, was never really taught that, but always had, even from a believing teenager, really had a desire in my heart, a drawing towards the kings of Israel, the prophets, even things within the Torah, and always kind of joked to myself, if I find somewhere along the line, if I find some Jewish heritage in my DNA, it would make sense about why I feel the way that I do. Now, my first trip to Israel was probably over 20 years ago on a traditional bus tour, and was actually with Messianic Jews as well as Christians in a joint trip, and really came away from that, just as many people do, just really ignited. The Bible comes alive, but something much deeper for me just really connected and really felt like that the Lord was saying this was something that I was going to be really more of a part of my life, a part of my, perhaps my DNA, if I can say that, and really just, following his lead from there.
All right. So what is it about Israel that's different than, say, getting a burden for India? I've been to India 25 years straight, or getting a burden for Mexico, or getting a burden for Russia or for China. Obviously, every nation is important in God's sight, and Jesus died for the people of all nations, and God's love is the same for all peoples and nations. But there's something different and unique when it comes to Israel. How would you capture that in terms of your own life experience?
In a word, covenant. I mean, there are things that are happening within the land today that are really an anomaly in human history. And so while there's lots of nations that have come and go, there's lots of beautiful places, there's only one place that the God of the Bible says that he's chosen. It talks about the land. The eyes of the Lord are on it from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. It drinks the dew of heaven. He talks about that Jerusalem is the center of the earth. He talks about making Jerusalem his habitation and the place where he's chosen to dwell. And so that fact alone, the fact that God has chosen it and stated it over and over within the Bible, that itself makes it unique from all other nations.
All right. So we are talking about divine history in a unique way, and in a place which in the past was visited by God, the place where he caused his temple to dwell, where his manifest presence was, where he brought the children of Israel, gave them that land, where the Messiah came and walked and rose from the dead, where the apostles were chosen and sent out. Doug, is it also a place not just of biblical history, but where there is biblical future to unfold as well?
No doubt about it. And that's really part of the book is that there are things that are happening within the last 70 years of Israel becoming a nation, and even more specifically within the really last 40 to 50 years, very much in our lifetime. There are things that are coming to pass today in very practical, tangible, verifiable, factual ways that the prophets have talked about, laid out 2,600 years ago, that have really been lying dormant up until this season. And if history, if the nation of Israel showed us anything, is that the fact that the prophets actually meant exactly what they said. It's actually unfolding exactly as they said. The deserts are blooming, the streams in the desert are being discovered, the waste places are being rebuilt, the Jewish people are returning, the branches are putting forth fruit, the land is physically reviving, and that's a lot of what Israel Rising is about.
All right, again, friends, the book in my hands. I wish I could take you through picture after picture after picture. We'll explain exactly what the book is about in a moment. Israel Rise and the Land of Israel Awakens. You can order it on our website. This is a great way to stand with us in Jewish ministry. And then to get the book yourselves, just go to Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. And I was just chatting with Scott Volk, my dear friend and co-host on our Holy Fire in the Holy Land Israel tour. We're extending this just a few more days in terms of people able to sign up for the tour, but we just both decided to do this. If you sign up today over at AskDrBrown.org for our tour to Israel, we want to give you a free copy of the Israel Rising book, just further incentive to get your deposit in today. You don't have to do anything. If it happens today, we'll take note of it and get you the book. All right. So, Doug, I was doing some shows on CBN a few months back, featuring one of my recent books. And afterwards, they expressed appreciation. You know, we was there for the whole day. There are different shows and things like that. And then they said, hey, we just want to give you something special, and gave me Israel Rising. That's the first time I saw the book. I thought, this is amazing. Yeah. And then we were getting ready to go to Israel, and my producer, Matt, was going to be going over for the first time. So I said, hey, take this book as you're praying, go through the pages, look at it. And then I just spoke for a colleague in Charlotte, North Carolina, an Israeli friend, and he gave me a copy of the book. So I've now been given 2 copies of this book by 2 major ministries. That's how much they appreciate this. So let's talk about the concept behind the book, Israel Rising, and how you came to work together with this photographer.
Yeah, Israel Rising is, we talk about it being a photo book and people refer to it as a coffee table book, but to me, it's really something so much more. The title, Israel Rising, Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens. The ancient prophecy is actually referring to Ezekiel 36, and it's a unique prophecy in that Ezekiel is told by God, prophesy to the mountains, to the rivers, to the hills, to the valleys, and which is unique. We often think of prophecy being spoken to kings or nations or people. And here God is speaking directly to the land. And if you're opening your Bible and you're reading through verses 8 to 12 and really on beyond that, he's talking specifically to the land. You will put forth branches and produce fruit. You will be cultivated and sown. I will turn to you and treat you better than what I did previously. Man and beast will be multiplied, cities will be rebuilt. He's talking to the land itself. And so that was something that as I've been in Israel really in the past 20 years, and more specifically back and forth on a more regular basis in the last 6 or 7 years, I've been watching with my own eyes the land beginning to change. There are certain areas of the desert that every time I'm there, there's a new date orchard, there's a new vineyard, there's new fields, there's new communities that are springing up. And I was rereading some of these scriptures, and I began just sort of wondering in myself, is this really happening? Is this what Ezekiel was talking about? I wonder if there's any other time in history that anything like this could have happened or happened. And that really began driving me. I have a love for history, and I love how God works in people and nations and throughout history, and began looking at the land and saying, I wonder if this is that.
Yeah, and if you go back in history, when Ezekiel 36 was first written, it's in the context of the Babylonian exile and the Jewish people coming out of exile back to the land of Judah and Israel, which had largely been abandoned. There was very little going on, and now it's going to be rebuilt, and there's going to be, as other prophets said, singing and dancing in the streets again, and weddings and children playing and all of this. But Ezekiel 36 speaks of far more than that.
That's
It
right.
speaks of things that have not yet happened. Let's say it prophesies 1 through 10 and only 1 through 4 came to pass. Well, it's still in the Bible. That means 5 through 10 must come to pass as well. Plus, things got much more desolate in the centuries following. The land of Israel got much more undeveloped in the centuries following than compared to Ezekiel's day, where it was roughly a 50 to 70 year time of exile. So Doug, the perspective now from before the land was developed until now is even more striking, isn't it?
Very much so. And part of the key of Ezekiel's prophecy, it isn't just simply that the land responding. He talks about when the land will respond. What is the time frame? And it talks about when the Jewish people return, and it says when you again become their possession. So it has to do with Israeli sovereignty. And in the book you'll find a chart where, I did, looking at the research, I wanted to know how much within that parameters that Ezekiel laid out, how many years from the time that Ezekiel spoke it up till 1948, how many years was there Israeli sovereignty in the land? And in that 2,600 year time span, there's only about 80 years during what's called the Hasmonean period, during the time of the Maccabees, or soon after the whole Maccabean revolt, where there was Israeli sovereignty. And some of that's written about in First Maccabees, and it actually talks about some of the prosperity of the land, about the vineyards and the growth and the beauty. And then anytime that the Jewish people lose sovereignty or are thrown out of the land, we begin seeing this pattern of just, everything begins to deteriorate. It's destroyed. It's flattened by wars or famines or whatever the case. And so, in the last 2,600 years prior to 1948, there was only 80 years that, that could have even possibly fit within the parameters. And that's why I was saying I'm pretty sure that this is happening right now.
Yeah. So we're not setting dates. We're not saying this means that Jesus is coming on a particular day. But what we are saying is that people are seeing things today that no generation has previously seen. We are saying that the table is set more now than it's ever been set before. Again, the author, Doug Hershey, photography by Elise Theriault, Israel Rising. So when we come back, I'm going to start going through some of the pages, and it's a gorgeous, large coffee table book. But on one side of the page, you have black and white pictures, say from before the reestablishment of the modern state of Israel. Then you have pictures today of how neighborhoods have been built where there were no neighborhoods, how things have been developed where there was no development, how literally there's a blooming, beautiful, fertile land where there was desolation before, swamps, in fact. We'll be right back.
Zvuv. Zvuv. A fly.
Fly. You say, what are you going to talk about in the Hebrew word of the day about a fly? Well, we'll start Old Testament, we'll go to New Testament. Here's where we start. There's one verse in many of our English translations, and King James and many of our English translations, that starts with the words dead flies. And in Hebrew, the word fly comes first. So flies of death. Dead flies. That's how it's translated. Dead flies cause the ointment of the apothecary, the ointment of the perfumer, to send forth a stinking smell. So does a little folly affect someone who has a reputation for wisdom and honor. So what a great picture from Proverbs chapter 10, verse 1. The perfume you worked so hard. Some perfumes are mega expensive, right? A dead fly drops in there and dies. Yeah, there's a stink that comes from it. That's what happens in our lives. That's what happens in our lives when we can have a reputation for wisdom and honor. You spend years and years working on your reputation, years and years and years, gaining respect, gaining honor, and then you mess up badly and you do something unwise and foolish, a little folly, and it can spoil your whole reputation. So remember, dead flies. But in the New Testament that Satan is referred to as Beelzebub or Beelzebul. There are different traditions in terms of what this comes from, but one view is it is a disparaging word, meaning Lord of the Flies, a disparaging title, meaning Lord of the Flies. There's another that associates with dung, Lord of the dung pile. But if it is in fact Zebub, Beelzebub, all right, then that would mean Beelzebub, right? Lord of the flies, a mocking, oh, the great and mighty Satan, you are just the Lord of the flies. That, in fact, is a biblical perspective.
Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the line of fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
All right, friends, here's what you get with the Israel Rising book. I'm just reading from our website, released to coincide with Israel's 70th anniversary. Israel Rising is a beautiful full-color book that juxtaposes rare historical photographs. We'll talk about how they came on those. Rare historical photographs of the Holy Land, some over 100 years old, never before released to the general public, with contemporary photos taken from the angle and vantage point exclusively for this collection. So over 200 images, plus there is a music CD with this, 14 powerful songs with a great power and heart for Israel, including music by Paul Wilbur. You get the audio CD and the book at our website, askdrbrown.org, askdrbrown.org. You'll see the banner right on the homepage. So sitting with author Doug Hershey. Doug, how did this concept come together? How did you get this idea of putting out the Israel Rising book in such gorgeous graphical form?
Well, it was really kind of by accident. I wish I could say I had sort of a divine revelation where I saw it all laid out. It was, like a lot of things in life, you just sort of following your journey. And like I said, I was in the land, and I was noticing the more I was back that in the Jordan Valley, between the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, that entire region is now becoming more and more green. Just from desert farming techniques, from new vineyards, new date palms, new fields. And
when did you first go to Israel? What year?
I want to say 21 years ago was my very first time.
Got it.
And
so even in that time, you've seen dramatic change.
Dramatic change. So much so when I take small groups there, sometimes I'm talking to them about just around this corner you're going to see everything you start to turn brown. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe it's the next corner. Maybe it's the next corner. And I began realizing that the further south we went, where what should be desert is now, through desert farming techniques, through irrigation, water technology, that these fields and orchards are really becoming established. And again, around that same time, I've just happened to be reading in Ezekiel and began really paying attention to the words and him talking about the land being cultivated and sown, and the land physically responding to Jewish presence. And I again began putting those two things together and go, I wonder if what I'm seeing right now is what Ezekiel talked about. And so, looking at the history and of course the old black and white photos. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, there's a lot of these little shops in the old city that have these little, beautiful old black and whites. It looks like a completely other world. But it's only like 80 to 100 years ago that these photos were taken. It's not in the scope of history. It's not that long ago. And so I began putting it together and going, even for friends that might never go to Israel, I wonder if there's a way to capture that. And so, anyhow, long story short, I ended up finding a way to obtain over 2,200 old photos that were taken between the 1880s and the 1940s, and then went back with a pro photographer, Elise Theriot, to reshoot those angles as close as we possibly could, to try to find the X marks the spot, the exact spot, to line up the angles and the results. I mean, even to me, it was a bit of an adventure to do it, but I mean, even to me, the results were stunning.
And how long did it take to do the photography, the current shots that contrast it with the old locations and old pictures?
Well, we brought those 2,200 old photos. We called them down to about 100. There's about 100 photo comparisons in the book from over 25 locations all over Israel. And so it took about 6 weeks of just, day after. I mean, that was the job for 6 weeks. And really, I say it's a job, but it was more like a treasure hunt. It was a joy. I mean, you woke up going, I wonder what I'm going to find today. I wonder what miracle I'm going to try to photograph today. And Elise was perfect for that.
So even though you had an idea of the change, it's not like you had a perfect map of Israel today in your head. It's not as if you knew exactly what each site was going to look like when you got there. So it must have been kind of staggering to put them side by side.
Yeah, in a lot of places, we didn't want to say, I didn't want to say, like, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to shoot some photos. I let the old photographs be the guide. And so there's a lot of beautiful photos of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv or wherever, but I wouldn't shoot a photo unless I had a black and white to recreate. So the whole point was sort of the treasure hunt to find the location where the angle is, and then to put it together, and then argue my way on top of rooftops, or or negotiate with somebody, or even at times, I mean, it was really kind of divine led, divine appointments. I mean, sometimes like in Jericho, I'd walk in and having no idea where some of these potentially angles were from, and find an old Arab man, and through a translator saying, this is a photo from. In fact, one of the photos in the book, I tell a little bit of the story about it. There's an old stone archway from the photos from 1890, and I'm thinking it's ruins in 1890. What are the chances it's still going to be there? And I go in and I show the photo, and this old Arab man says, "Oh, that's the sugar mill. Let me take you to it."
Mm.
And so it was just sort of the right person at the right time to find the right locations and to capture. So it was just this ongoing sort of treasure hunt. I keep using that phrase, but that's really how it felt.
Yeah, I can imagine the excitement of waking up each day, and then it is the issue of how to find some of the places because they changed so dramatically. It's
Mhm.
one thing if you're looking out over a valley and you see certain topography, and okay, this is but another thing where so much has been built up that wasn't there before. So much is thriving and growing out. A lot of it was desert, and there's been because of the pressure on Israel and the challenges, Israel's had to be more ingenious, and obviously there's some of God's grace and calling in the midst of it, but getting multiple harvests over the course of a year. And remember, a lot of people died of the Israeli pioneers draining the swamps.
That's
I
right.
mean, we talk about draining the swamp in DC. I mean, they were literally draining swamps and dying of malaria.
That's right.
And now you go there and it's so lush and thriving. And what's also interesting in Ezekiel 36, Doug, is that it says that God's not bringing us back because of our repentance, but because he's jealous for his name's sake. And once we're in the land, he'll sprinkle clean water on us. So
Absolutely.
we're even seeing that little by little, the reviving and raising up of the Messianic Jewish remnant, of the Israel within Israel, of Israelis coming to faith and living the Messiah. This has happened back in the land.
And you make a great point. I'm beginning to teach around the country and show this presentation to a lot of different places. And sometimes people that are a little skeptical or, borderline anti-Semitic within the church, may come up and say, I could support Israel if they, were morally right, or if they were this, or if they were that, or they didn't kill Palestinians, or whatever their line of thinking. And my response is pointing to exactly what you've talked about, is that it's a very noble assumption. It's just actually opposite of what the prophet said would happen. He said he would bring them all back, and then he would sprinkle clean water. And then that Christian verse that we take really kind of out of context about removing a stony heart and putting in a heart of flesh, and removing my spirit, removing your spirit and putting my spirit in, all of that is in the context of the Jewish people coming back to the land. And what God says is he's bringing them all back with the intention of a cleansing. So my point is the fact that God is gathering back Jewish people back to the land that he promised them, and most of them probably are primarily secular, who give no thought or no care to really anything of the scriptures, let alone to the heart of God. The fact that that's happening is actually falling exactly in line with exactly how Ezekiel said he was going to do it.
Yeah, and what I find remarkable, as I look at comments, social media comments responding to our podcasts and our videos and things like that, is no matter how clearly God acts in history and acts in front of our eyes, you're going to have people, whether they're just anti-Semites or whether they have a problem with God, whatever it is, they're going to reject what's happening in front of their eyes. There were so many people that said God's finished with Israel, no more purposes for Israel, God's done with them, they're forever cursed and scattered. And then you have the rebuilding of Israel, which, again, the most graphic way I've ever seen it illustrated in my life is right here in this book, Israel Rising, because it is the most graphic side-by-side presentation that's been done. God does it in front of people's eyes, and people begin to say, well, I guess God's not finished with Israel. And then enough time goes by and they say, well, the people in the land are not really Jews. They're not the real Israel. And again, it's that same old anti-Semitism rising. And when you confront it, of course, it gets denied. But Doug, it would be hard for something to happen visibly and tangibly in front of our eyes, any more visible and tangible than the restoration of modern Israel.
Well, and that's a point that I make when I'm talking to people as you are as well in that term, is that putting the Bible aside, Israel in the land, people returning to a land, it's an anomaly in human history. There's been no other people group that have been on a particular piece of land and then have been forcibly removed to come back to the same piece of land for a couple hundred years, to then again be scattered throughout the earth for 2,000 years, to come back to the exact same piece of real estate as an identifiable, recognizable people speaking the same language, same culture, same scriptures. It's never happened before in human history. It just so happens that it's the people group that the God of the Bible says he's made an everlasting covenant with. So when you have these unique, rare anomalies in human history and you're still trying to take God out of it, then you're creating more holes in the bucket than you are of truth. And that's, at some point you have to look at the Bible and say, okay, well, maybe God got lucky. Maybe he guessed well or something. You know what I'm saying? I mean, at some point it comes back to the divine nature of God and the fact that there's no other people group, there's no other nation that's had its history foretold, its destruction, its revival back to a world power as Israel, and we're beginning to see that, and that's some of what the photos are capturing.
Yeah, even all the scriptures about Jerusalem and Jerusalem, Zechariah 12, Zechariah 14 being a stumbling block for the entire world, or all the world coming up against Jerusalem. Why Jerusalem? Why that city? Why was that one singled out so many years in advance? It's because we serve the God who sees and knows everything. And if you read Isaiah 40 through 48, even through 55, there's a great emphasis that he alone is God, that he alone is God, that the gods of the nations are not gods at all. And one of his proofs is, I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. I'm going to show you, I'm going to send my people into exile. I'm going to bring them out of exile. Those words thunder all the louder today. And by the way, for those watching on YouTube, just looking in the comments section, hey, Curtis, I hate to say it, while you do say some right things about Jesus, you say a lot of wrong things about Israel and the Jewish people. And yes, some of it is classic anti-Semitism. I got to tell you the truth, buddy. Some of what you post is classic anti-Semitism and does not belong on our site. That's just the truth. Bottom line, though, is God's going to do what he does. And the Messiah who returns is going to be a glorified Jew. We'll be right back. Have you ever heard it said there's no such thing as an atheist, that no real atheists exist, that everybody really knows there's a God? Well, I don't agree with that. And my wife, Nancy, who was an atheist when we met at 19 and a hardcore atheist at that, had been ever since she was maybe 8 years old. She absolutely takes offense in that statement. Now, if you mean scientifically, that it's impossible to prove the non-existence of God and therefore you cannot scientifically demonstrate that. Okay, that's another subject. But are there people who sincerely and genuinely in the heart of hearts do not believe that there is a God, that there's anything beyond the material realm? Certainly. Do some of them hate the God they deny? Exodus chapter 20, verse 5. Exodus chapter 20, verse 5, in the Ten Commandments, God speaks about the idols. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. So, yes, there are some people who hate God. They see who he is, they see what he stands for, they believe he's real, and they hate him. There are others that deny his existence, but act as if they hate him. You know, the summary of many of the new atheist books, the Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens books, the best summary of some of them is, there is no God and I hate him. So there are some people who hate what this God stands for, or hate what they believe this God has done in the name of religion, or hate the God of the Old Testament, but they deny his existence. So that's an interesting thing. But there are other atheists that simply, intellectually or experientially, don't believe there's a God. And they don't go around hostile and angry towards him all the time. That's a fact. And there are others, and I want to appeal to this, who I believe have a very high and lofty view of God and think that if this God existed, who was so good, who was so perfect, who was so powerful, he couldn't possibly allow the suffering and pain in this world. He would have to intervene more than he has. So I believe for some atheists, their rejection of God is because of a pain in their heart. Not so much an anger, but they prayed and didn't find an answer, that they once believed the Bible, but it seemed in their critical, deepest, darkest moment that this God let them down, or they just hurt so much for a hurting human race, they can't understand how an omnipotent, loving being with all wisdom and all foreknowledge could let this happen, let a world be like this. So I believe there's much to appeal to in those people, and to say the God you dream about is actually real beyond your wildest dreams. You just don't have the capacity to fully understand him. I want to introduce you to that God.
It's The Line of Fire with your host, Dr. Michael Brown. Get into the line of fire now by calling 866-34-TRUTH. Here again is Dr. Michael Brown.
Can I tell you one reason why so many Christians and people in the world have a problem with Israel? Well, it's not because Israel is far from perfect, although there are many amazing things about Israel and many things where they really seek to act with tremendous ethics. But the reason that people have a hard time with Israel is because it's God acting in history. Here, were you and I there when Jesus rose from the dead? No. If you're a follower of Jesus, you know that he's risen. You've experienced him in your own life, but we weren't there when he rose. Was anybody there at the time of the Exodus? No. Anybody there of us, right? When Elijah called out fire from heaven? No. And anybody there when the sick were healed in Jerusalem through Peter's shadow? No, none of us were there, but we've been here to see the resurrection of modern Israel out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And we have been here to see prophecies fulfilled. No, I'm not a date setter. No, in fact, Dr. Craig Keener and I have a book coming out in March, Not Afraid of the Antichrist, Why We Don't Believe in a Pre-Trib Rapture. We're anything but date setters, and yet it is undeniable. It is undeniable that God has kept his promises, scattered the lost sheep of the house of Israel throughout the entire world, and not because of our righteousness, but his goodness and grace brought us back to the land, and literally brought blooming, beautiful vegetation and flowers and vineyards and gardens and farms out of what was a desolate waste. My guest today, Doug Hershey, a great love for Israel, a great understanding of God's purposes for Israel, and teamed with photographer Elise Theriault to put out an amazing book, which I'm holding. It takes two hands to hold in your hands. Israel Rising, Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens, The Land of Israel Reawakens. So on one page, you have a black and white picture of Israel, say 70 or 90 years ago. And then on the other page, Israel today. It is stunning. Black and white and color gives you a sense of the glory and beauty of what God has done. By the way, to mention this to you, you can get this together with a powerful audio CD with great music on this very same theme at our website, packaged together. Go to Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. Doug, let's take an example. Take me to a place. You got some rare photographs you were able to get, 2,200. You culled them down to the top 100 old black and white photographs. Take me back in time to one of these locations, and then what happened with your current photograph?
One of the photos I'd mentioned, even just earlier about the photo of the Jordan Valley in Jericho, and seeing some of these old archways from ruins from who knows how long, and that these photos from 120 some years ago, and really just a completely empty valley. To find the exact spot where that photographer shot those angles, and really seeing just the entire valley being full. There's photos in the book of the Hula Valley, which is about 30 minutes north of the Sea of Galilee. One of the places you mentioned about being in a malaria-infested swamp, that's exactly what it was, really, up until the 50s and the 60s. And there are reports not only of in the Hula Valley, but some other places out by the coast where, exactly as you're saying, there are these Jewish pioneers climbing into the swamps, digging out irrigation ditches by hand, draining them really with soup cans. They're dying of malaria. Today, the Hula Valley is really one of the most fruitful in Israel, and so we have a photo in there finding the exact angle of a completely empty valley. You can see Mount Hermon in the background. In the foreground, there's some hills that are empty. Today, the exact same angle, you can see that the entire valley is full. You can see the snow on Mount Hermon, and in the foreground is is a little artisan village called Rosh Pina up in as you're heading up into the Hula Valley. Beautiful, incredible wine, hummus there now. It's a beautiful, amazing place. But these photos really are only gosh, even 50, 60 years apart, and it's just stunning. Another location down in the very southern tip of Israel in Eilat. Eilat is on the Red Sea. When you're standing on the beach in Eilat, you can see Egypt to the right and Jordan and Saudi Arabia to the left. And we have photos of just an empty foreground with mountains in the background. And 50 years later, this is most of this is in our lifetime.
Amazing.
50 years later, the photo that I took to get that same angle, like I had to argue my way on top of the Caesar Hotel to get the angle of the airport. But there's palm trees and shopping malls. It literally went from when we talk about the towns blooming in the desert, this is one of them. There was literally nothing there, and anyone who's been down to that part of the region or that part of Israel, it is hot. It is in the middle of the desert. There's life. It's blooming. It's now a beautiful, beautiful tropical port, and that's just there's multiple examples all through the book like that.
And tell us about Elise, the photographer. What's her background?
Elise is a freelance photographer out of Chico, California, and she had actually been with me. I actually knew her parents before I knew her. Very, very talented photographer and up and coming. I had her on one of my, her and her parents on one of my Ezra Adventures trips. It's my travel company connected with the book. And I've seen lots of photos of Israel. I've seen lots of angles, and she just was capturing something I had never seen before and began talking to her and kicking some ideas around. And at that time, we're kind of nickel and diming some ideas. I didn't have the money to go out and to find a high-powered, expensive photographer. And truthfully, I thought that she was shooting as good, if not better, than some of the high-powered photographers anyhow. And so we became friends and really began working on a list. And I did a lot of the research and was, of course, using her to put everything together and shoot the shots, which, as you can see, came out phenomenal. They were amazing.
Yeah, amazingly done. And here's what I find really, really interesting, friends. No matter how many times we say things, that Jews need Jesus to be saved just like everyone else, that there's no favoritism in God, that both Jew and Gentile sin and fall short and need a redeemer. No matter how many times we say that, the moment we talk about God's purposes for Israel, everyone's, well, you say they don't need you say. And it's just, even as I'm looking, Doug, at some of the YouTube interaction, it's so extraordinary. By the way, one of the most interesting things is I'm watching people comment on our YouTube feed saying, yeah, they censor comments on this site as people are posting. If you post blatantly anti-Semitic things, yeah, we'll block you. But I challenge those of you who say that we censor comments and things like that. Tell you what, go to the Ask Dr. Brown Facebook page and look at discussions there. Go to our YouTube page, Ask Dr. Brown, and look through, just be conservative. The last 100,000 comments, how's that? And see how many tens of thousands are dissenting comments, unless you use profanity, attack individuals, or blatantly make false accusations against groups. You can dissent with me. You can dissent with me 24/7. Doug, why is it that it seems people have a hard time, people who have received grace, who stand by grace alone, why is it they have such a hard time believing God can have mercy on Israel?
That's it really comes down to where our faith is at and where and how we believe God. The fact is that we should be, for as much as some of these dissenters will throw Israel under the bus and say, well, they didn't listen and they were hard-headed and God rejected them. And, we should be thankful that in a way that Israel has been like that, because the way that we know about God's faithfulness and his love and his kindness and forgiveness, if you have a friend or a spouse that keeps that we think of as being kind and forgiving and merciful and gentle, we know those things because somebody's been pushing that button over and over and over and over and over again. And so when God is telling Israel specifically, I'm bringing you back to the land, not because you're righteous, not because you've done right things, but because I've made a promise, he's saying, you've been pushing my buttons over and over, and I'm responding in kindness. I'm responding in love. And that is our demonstration of what God's character is like. Everything that we know about the character of God, that we're talking about love and grace and forgiveness and mercy, we've learned his character by how he's demonstrated his heart towards Israel. And so, yes, are they hard-headed? Are they stiff-necked? Are they this? Are they that? I mean, you can go through a list of my problems, as well. I'm
Yeah.
I'm all of
Count
those
me
things.
in.
Yeah, I'm
Count me
all of
in.
those as well. But the fact is that it has less to do with about the actual people, and it has to do with the covenants. Because if God is sovereign, and this is something when I'm teaching, I always ask this question: is God sovereign, yes or no? And of course, everyone says yes. Well, if God is sovereign, then doesn't he have the right to choose whatever people group and put them on any piece of land for any particular time that he chooses without my thoughts or opinions? Because if he's not sovereign and then he's not really who he says he is. He's not really God. And if he's listening to me, he's certainly not God. But if he is God, then it becomes less about the people and the land and more about his character and his sovereign choice. Because if God is sovereign and we're the ones that are devoted to him, shouldn't we be following him? I mean, it's the same as when we read the Bible. Are we reading the Bible so that we can try to make it apply to our lives, or are we allowing his spirit to change our lives to go according to the Bible? So it really becomes less about Israel and the land and more about who is God like, what is his character, and just the fact that he has told Abraham, I'm going to choose your family to demonstrate what my character is like to the rest of the world. And if they reject you, they reject me. And so it all comes back to less about Israel and more about the heart and the character of God.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, friends, the book, one of the more beautiful coffee table books that I've seen. And I mean, I could actually kind of get lost during the show and keep looking through the pictures here. Israel Rising. You can get the book and an audio CD through our website, AskDrBrown.org. Oh, and let me just mention this. Our tour to Israel, Holy Fire in the Holy Land, is going to be the most special tour that we've ever done. You see, every year, well, we've only done 2 tours before, even though I've been asked to do them for many, many years. Just because when I go to Israel, I want to minister there. I don't just want to do a tour. I want to minister to people. So we talked it through with our team and said, well, why not do both? Tour by day, ministry by night. So you get the advantage of it right there, step by step, going through the land and seeing these places and connecting with believers in the land. And yeah, we'll do baptisms at the River Jordan. And yeah, I'll teach about Elijah calling down fire from heaven and Mount Hermon and those kinds of things. But you'll have a tour guide for the whole tour. And then at night, we'll do meetings together. We'll have Q&A times face-to-face after our meals. We'll do worship and preaching. You'll come with me as I do my radio show. So we got some great, great, great things planned. But we're about to close out registration. So if you want to come, sign up today. Go to our website, AskDrBrown.org, and you'll see on the banner the Israel tour. But just to be a blessing to you and to give you further encouragement, if you sign up today, we want to give you a free copy of the Israel Rising book if you sign up for the tour today and get your deposit. And so you can do that again at the AskDrBrown.org website, Holy Fire in the Holy Land. All right, we come back. I've got some questions for author Doug Hershey. What about the Palestinians? Does God care about them? And is the restoration of modern Israel any different than, say, the building up of Saudi Arabia in the desert? I mean, what's the difference here? We'll talk about that when we come back. When I came to faith in 1971 and the immediate days after that, so I knew there were people that were called to be pastors, and there were evangelists. I knew those too. So the evangelist, that was someone that traveled from church to church, and the pastor was one state of one place. That's what I knew. And then I found out that there's some called to be teachers, that Jesus spent a lot of his ministry teaching, okay, so that was another calling. But I remember asking one day, are there prophets around today? I asked my pastor, do you think there are prophets today? By which I thought of like an Isaiah, maybe in a cave somewhere today with a long beard and a scroll. And he said, yeah, I believe there's some prophets today. And, the question of apostles we didn't really talk about because you had the 12 apostles and that was it. But then you have Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. Ephesians 4:11, speaking of Jesus when he ascended, that he gave the apostles, or he gave some to be apostles, prophets, evangelists, shepherds, or pastors, and teachers. Now, some say this is what we call fivefold ministry. apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, teachers. Some say it's really fourfold: apostles, prophets, evangelists, and then pastor/teacher. Do these ministries all exist today? Yes, I believe they do. No, you don't have the 12 apostles or anyone functioning with that same authority today or writing scripture. But do you have people who are called to be apostles, just like, for example, Barnabas is called an apostle in Acts 14? It just means a sent one. These who are foundation layers, who are spiritual fathers, who might be church planters, who might be movement leaders. I believe, say, someone like Hudson Taylor or someone like William Booth. I believe they were apostles, even though they didn't carry that name or have that concept. I believe they are. One of my friends in India who's planted over 7,000 churches, who's planted ministries in other nations, who's built hospitals, who's been a prophetic witness for the Lord, who's almost stoned to death for his faith. We're stoned for his faith. I believe he's a modern-day apostle, even though he wouldn't use that term. And yes, there are clearly prophets today. Read the end of 1 Corinthians 12, and you'll see prophets, apostles, all tied in together with miracles and teachers and administrators and tongues, all tied in together. Those who are hearing the voice. Yeah, I'm holding up the Israel Rising book, and again, you get it on our website with a great audio CD with it as well, askdrbrown.org. So I'm looking at Tel Aviv, and on the left side, this is Dizengoff Street looking north, somewhere between 1934 and 1939. Okay, I'm looking at that, and now shot in 2016, the exact same location, looking north. You could see some of the buildings on either side. What's striking, Doug, is that 34 to 39, there's these tiny little trees.
Mm-hmm.
They've got the guard rails around them so they grow up straight and they're protected, etc. And now you've got these beautiful big, I mean, that's just one little snapshot tells you everything.
Yeah, and it's one of the comments that I make as I'm taking people through Israel is we talk about the trees as we just in a course of conversation as we're driving through point A to point B, and especially in northern Israel, I make the comment to my group, somebody look out the window and find me a tree that has a large trunk system, because it's difficult to do. And prior to the British, when under the Ottoman rule from 1517 to 1917, the Ottomans have a taxation policy that's based on trees, and they tax you according to the amount of trees you have in your land. And so, if you don't want to pay taxes, what do? You cut down the trees, and most historians agree that it's in that 400-year period of the Ottoman rule that the land suffers some of the greatest desolation. You take away the trees, you're changing the weather patterns, the topsoil changes, animal populations leave, everything changes. And in the last 100 years, the Jewish National Fund has recorded that they've planted over 250 million trees in the last 100 years, and those are all by hand. And so there's a couple photos in the book where one in particular from the Jezreel Valley, where I went to take a photo of this old black and white photo of a kibbutz called Ein Herod, and I went to thinking more about the growth of the kibbutz. And what was most stunning was the black and white photo, and you see this very clearly in the book. The black and white photo has no trees on the mountains behind it, and the new photo has trees all the way through the mountains. Like somebody climbed those mountains to plant those trees. And when you plant trees on mountains, weather patterns change, topsoil is naturally recreated. I mean, the whole ecosystem begins responding. The area begins getting more rain and more moisture, and that begins to literally physically change the whole topography of the soil and how all of that works. And to me, that was some of the most stunning aspects. And even more so, it's the first thing that Ezekiel 36 says will happen. God says to the land, you will put forth branches and produce fruit, and then the land will be cultivated and sown, and waste places will be rebuilt. But the first thing that Ezekiel 36 mentions is about the branches putting forth fruit. And one of the most dramatic changes that happened in Israel as Israel is coming closer to 1948 to becoming a nation was the planting of this massive amount of trees. And so when you're in Israel driving through, it's the point being, it's difficult to find a tree or a forest with huge root systems, because back 70, 80 years ago, they just weren't there. So, I mean, there's some history and photos of hillsides that are now considered forests in Israel that 100 years ago were just completely barren and desolate and just completely naked.
And, I'm looking at a comment by Jed. I boast for Jesus Christ and against the false god of Judaism. Jed, the God of Judaism is the father of the Lord Jesus. God of Judaism is the God of the Bible, bringing these passages in Scripture to pass. The fact is that the Jewish people do not know that God fully because they do not recognize his son, the Messiah. But the boasting about Jesus Christ also means boasting in God, his Father. The glory that goes to Jesus goes to the Father, and it's the Father who's bringing these things to pass because he made a covenant promise with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not based on their works, but based on his faithfulness. So, Doug, if someone said, hey, look, a beautiful book, amazing book, but why is this different than, say, the building up of Saudi Arabia or Qatar or some of these other places, or Dubai, that now these big cities, and they weren't much before? What would you say to that?
Yeah, sometimes people will say, any city looks better now than it did 100 years ago. What's the big difference? The big difference is that no other people group, no other city, no other nation on earth had its history foretold 2,600 years ago to watch it unfold exactly as it's happening today. Not the Romans, not the Greeks, not the Chinese, not the Persians. There is no other ancient people group dating back that long that has these things foretold. And again, Ezekiel 36 in your Bible describes when the Jewish people return and when the land again becomes its possession. God even says, talking to the land, I'll treat you better than what you ever been treated before. And quite literally, that's happening right now, both in exports, both in farming, both in the people multiplying, the Jewish people returning. The most repeated promise in the Bible and in the Old Covenant is that God will return his people back to the land. It is happening in our day in a most profound way that's never happened before in history. Not Qatar, Saudi Arabia, any European country, they cannot compare, just simply because this is something. Take any ancient writing and compare it to where those people are at. There is no comparison. So that in and of itself, just to answer very, very plainly, the difference is God. God said 2,600 years ago, he said he was going to do it. He's doing it right now. And in fact, towards the end of Ezekiel 36, he tells us why he's doing it. He says, I'm going to begin causing the land to respond. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he's saying so that the nations around will know that I am the Lord. So he's saying, in fact, he specifically says, I'm going to turn it into a Garden of Eden so that the nations around will know. So in other words, he's saying, I'm going to use Israel in the midst of the region, in the midst of the world, to physically respond in such a way that nations around are going to have no other choice but to say only God could have done this. And I believe we're at the very beginning stages of that happening. Never before have we seen anything in human history that has, and again, check out the photos for yourself in the book, but we're providing photographic evidence that nothing like this has been done before.
And what about the Palestinians? Do you just say, well, God's blessing Israel and we don't care about the Palestinians? Is that your heart?
Not at all. God's heart is for all peoples. He's made a promise and he's made a covenant. But when we're talking about a couple points, when we're talking about Palestinians in general, just the name Palestinian, I've got some friends named Rosenfeld that live up in the Galilee. She's over 80 years old and was alive at the creation of the state of Israel in 48. She was born, I think, in I have to do the math, like in the early 40s, late 30s. And her comment to me is this whole Palestinian thing is silly. My birth certificate says that I'm Palestinian, and she's Jewish to the core. And so there is newspaper reports and newspaper clippings where Arabs in the early 1940s are shunning the name Palestinian because they recognize that the name Palestinian refers to Jewish communities that are in the region of the British Mandate of Palestine. So many people that are reading the Jerusalem Post today don't realize that the original the origin of the Jerusalem Post is a Jewish newspaper that was first called the Palestine Post. Yep. That was writing about Jewish communities. And so when 1948 comes, then all of the Jewish Palestinian communities are now Israelis. This name Palestinian disappears really until the early mid 1960s after the Six-Day War, and Yasser Arafat gets in and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's number one. Number two, when people talk about an indigenous Arab population, quote unquote Palestinian population dating back to the 1800s, show me. I have over 100 black and white photos in that book that will show you empty landscapes. We have quotes from not only, most famously, Mark Twain, but not only Mark Twain, but dating back centuries that describe the land as completely empty and desolate. Mark Twain talks about going
Yeah.
10 miles in any direction and not seeing any form of human habitation.
Right. I mean, and there were people living in the land. We understand that there was a constant Jewish presence, there was an Arab presence, there were others. But a lot of the real influx began in the late 1800s as more Jews began to come back and improve the economy. Many Arabs began to come back. So you had more Arabs than Jews. But the fact is, the numbers started to really increase in the late 1800s. Again, friends, amazing book, Israel Rises, The Land of Israel Reawakens. You can get it together with a powerful audio CD, music by Paul Wilbur and others, Ancient Prophecy, Modern Lens, all at our website, AskDrBrown.org. And folks keep asking, well, look, I mean, the New Testament said Jews without Jesus are lost. And 1 John 2, who is a liar, but he who denies that Jesus is the Messiah. He is Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Whoever denies the Son does not have the Father either. He who acknowledges the Son has the Father also. Yeah, amen. Amen. That's why, as a Jew, I preach the gospel to my people day and night so that they can be rightly connected to the God they pray to. I want to challenge everyone that has issues with Judaism and the Jewish people. I just saw a conference, Doug, advertising, if you hate Judaism, come to this conference. I mean, talk about ignorance and bigotry.
Wow.
So get a Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, and go through it and pray. Go through it and read the prayers in there. And instead of the hatred, you'll have a broken heart. And so these people are praying for redemption and praying for the coming of Messiah and praying for God to realize his purposes. And God himself is acting in history in front of our eyes. And yet some of us have so many biases, so much bigotry, so much misunderstanding that we cannot even see what God is doing in front of our eyes. So listen, I want to bring everyone to Israel with me and their other tours. Check out Ezra Adventures, which Doug Hershey himself leads. And this is for small groups going over there, something to really look into, Ezra Adventures. But we want everyone to come and see the land. Even if you go, though, this is an amazing, I've been over and over to Israel. This is still an amazing, eye-opening book. And for everyone who can't go, get the book. And it's not too early. We're in September. Get a few copies to give out as presents for the holidays at Ask Dr. Brown, askdrbrown.org. The book, Israel Rising, The Land of Israel Reawakens, by Doug Hershey, with photographs by Elise Theriault. Doug, thanks for being with us today.
Hey, I love it. It's been great. Thank you.
God bless.